Hello everybody and welcome to our Brexit Where Now lunch at the FCC. I'm just going to start with a quick notice. We've got an event, the wall event, which runs from June 6th to June the 30th. This is images of Tiananmen and beyond, and this is taken by photographers who were there. At the launch event on June the 6th, which is 6:30 in the evening, we're going to have some of the photographers who were there talking about it. So mark that one in your diaries. Right. I'm not going to give much of an introduction because I think we all want somebody to answer where Brexit's going, and Philip, it's going to be your job today to do that. I think it's fair to say that few, if any of us who followed the Brexit saga, expected to be anywhere like we are now, 3 years on, from that historic vote, heartbreaking vote, I fully confess, from my point of view, in June 2016. You might as well know where I stand on this. Look, but here we are. In theory, the UK is on its way out, but we're still not clear exactly how or even when that happens. And there's this growing movement calling for a second referendum, which could, in theory, call the whole thing off. We've also now got a Conservative Party leadership contest underway, which conveniently happened since we booked Philip for this lunch, so that gives him even more to talk about. And please feel free to ask him questions. And that means that before long, whatever happens there, the UK will have a new Prime Minister. I think we've got, 11 candidates now?
Yes, 11.
We were quite proud of our hotly contested FCC elections recently, right? We pale in comparison to the Tory party. Obviously, we're holding this lunch just after the weekend's European elections, so we're very grateful to have an expert like Philip to make sense of what those votes showed. Now, I think you probably all read the bio, but Philip is Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. He's the author of a series of books on British general elections. This one from 2017, called The Bible of General Elections by David Dimbleby, which for those of you who've had to sit through British general elections will know that's a pretty high honour for him to have. Philip at least brings a little bit of humour to this subject, as you can see from his delightful illustration of hell that he chose to start this lunch with. I hope you had your dinner before you looked at it. Last month in the Times of London, Philip managed to liken Margaret Thatcher, the darling of the right, to Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, the hero of the fairly far left, in the way in which their respective rises to power were playing out. Now, last week he went one better in my book. In a piece on leadership races, he managed to compare David Miliband, the one-time hope of the Labour Party, to Diamond Tiara. He's a My Little Pony who loses a vote in a My Little Pony story to Pipsqueak because Diamond Tiara was unkind to the other ponies. All right, Philip, top that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you very much to the FCC for inviting me. Ever since I read The Honourable Schoolboy many years ago, I knew that the FCC was where all the clever people gathered, so it's a delight to be here. When we were discussing when to do this talk, we really struggled to find a good time. And as you say, in some ways, this is the perfect timing coming off the back of the European elections and the leadership election. In another sense, though, it's an absolutely terrible time because I'm not sure we're any further on in answering some of these questions than we were. So my very first slide today is simply the document that was circulated in 2016 by the government, which said to everybody who took part, this is your decision and the government will implement what you decide. 3 years on from that decision, we are no nearer implementing anything, and I think that partly explains where we are. I'm also going to begin, I think, by disappointing some of you. If you've come here and paid your $180 in order to find out where we're going, the honest answer to most of the questions about Brexit is, I don't know. And some of you may want your $180 back at this point. And it's a real problem. It's a problem for me, people like me who are supposed to write on this stuff. I know from my conversations with journalists, it is a real problem for political journalists. Their trade in many cases consists of speaking to people who know what's going on, being briefed, making a few phone calls, finding out, and then explaining. When they make those phone calls at the moment in Britain, nobody knows what's going on. There isn't any one person anywhere who knows what's going on or what's going to happen. And that both explains why we're all in a bit of state of uncertainty, but it also explains quite a lot about the Brexit process itself. At heart, because we are still in that state of uncertainty, almost everyone still thinks they can win. The people who think we should leave the EU with no deal think that is within their grasp. The people who want a negotiated deal think it is within their grasp. The people who think we're going to have a second referendum, mostly, if not solely, in order to reverse the first referendum, think it is within their grasp. The people who think we should just revoke Article 50 completely without a second referendum, they think it's in their grasp too. And because everybody thinks they can still win, nobody wants to compromise, which is also explaining a lot of what is going on at the moment. So I thought I'd start with some of the things we do know. I'm going to start with the European elections of last week. These were a series of elections that were not supposed to happen, which the government did an awful lot to try to make sure did not happen, but which A, happened, and then B, set a series of records. So these are the main results in terms of both MEPs elected and vote share. The Brexit party is at the top. This is a party that wasn't even formed 2 months ago, topped the poll, gaining almost 32% of the vote. The Liberal Democrats, a party that was written off a couple of years ago, came second with their best ever performance in a European election. The Green Party performed the best they've ever done since 1989. The Scottish National Party, which if you look at the vote share here of 3.6% looks a bit feeble, but they only stand in Scotland. In Scotland they polled about 38% of the vote and won in almost every single local authority, their best European performance ever. Plaid Cymru, the Welsh National Party, 1% doesn't sound very impressive, but again, they only stand in Wales. That was one of their best performances ever, and for the first time in any Welsh-wide electoral contest, they beat the Labour Party. And then you have Labour and the Conservative Party. The Labour Party polled 14.1% of the vote. That is the worst performance by the Labour Party in any election in Britain since the Labour Party became a major political party. You have to go back to December 1910, and in December 1910 they only stood in about 50 constituencies. And remember, Labour are in opposition, and opposition parties normally do well in these sort of elections. For the Conservative Party, they polled 9% of the vote. That's the governing party, polling 9% of the vote. The worst performance by any major British political party going back at least to 1832. The only reason most people stop at 1832 is because records become a bit less hazy after 1832, and because it's not really very sensible to go back much further. It's essentially, the two major parties got hammered on a scale that it is very difficult, I think, to comprehend. My favourite bit of election night came when one Labour spokesperson on the radio admitted that they'd had a difficult night, but pointed out the Conservatives had had a worse night. And this brought to mind a sort of two bald men arguing over a comb sort of situation. These were two people representing political parties that had got hammered, and all they were arguing about was who had got hammered most. The two-party share of the two supposedly major parties was below 25%. This was a sort of impressive two-fingered salute by the British electorate to the established parties. If you map it, as this map does, you see a couple of really obvious things. The yellow at the top is Scotland. There's a very nice, easy border there between Scotland and England, for anyone who doesn't know their geography. The SNP dominate in almost all of the Scottish assemblies. You see little bits of orange, those are Liberal Democrats. You see little bits of red, that's Labour. A handful of London boroughs and a handful of bigger cities where Labour managed to top the poll. Little bits of green, both the Plaid and the Green Party. And the blue is the Brexit Party. Some of you may be thinking, those of you that know your British politics, but I thought blue was the Conservative colour, so isn't it a really silly thing to do to put like the blue of the Brexit and the blue of the Conservative Party on the same map? How are we supposed to tell which one is the Brexit blue and which one is the Conservative blue? There's a really easy answer to that, which is there is no Conservative blue on this map. They didn't top the poll in a single local authority. For those of you interested in Northern Ireland, apologies, it's left off the map, but it's left off the map for a very good reason, which is that they use a different electoral system, so you can't sort of map it in quite the same way. Anyone who's looking at that map and thinking, it looks terribly familiar, I'm sure I've seen that before, it looks a bit like that. British politics is essentially Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, and that's a very easy way to remember it. And during all of this coverage of the election, you are reaching for your metaphors to try and describe this. So it's all talk of tectonic plate shifting, and you've all done intro paragraphs, and you're looking for that meta. The tectonic plates have shifted, the earthquake of British politics, yada yada. I remember in 1997. The late, great Tony King describing the 1997 election as like a meteorite hitting the earth and destroying all life. That was an election in which the Conservative Party got 30% of the vote. So I struggle to know how you describe an election in which the Conservative Party gets less than 10% of the vote. So everyone talks about how shocking and unsurprising and so on this is. I want to just, before moving on to talk about the Conservatives in a bit more detail, talk about ways in which this is maybe not that surprising for a number of senses. And the first is that we know, and we have known since the 1960s, that voters are becoming much more volatile in Britain. They're much more willing to switch parties these days. Vote for one party in one election, another party in another election. The days when people voted for party after party after party, the same party in election after election, those days have gone. And so we might expect to see more of these sort of elections coming around. It's only 2 years ago that the two-party share in the British general election of 2017 was the highest it had been for 40 years. It's now dropped to the lowest we've ever seen. And I think that's an indication that voters are willing to switch parties. And this is especially true of European elections. It always has been true of European elections. This is a graph showing the vote share of the Labour Party in red, Conservatives in blue, and others in every single European election since 1979, when the first one was held. And whilst the 2019 two-party share is the lowest share, it is the lowest in a trend which, with just one exception, was declining election after election after election after election. And in fact, if you graph it down, 2019 isn't that much of an outlier once you take into account what's been happening in previous elections. Voters are willing to switch. They're particularly willing to switch in European elections. This was a European election where you could argue the stakes were even lower than they normally are, and people took the opportunity to vote accordingly. And when you look in detail at some of the vote shares, you start thinking, well, this isn't maybe as surprising as it looks. Those of you that know your British electoral geography, the Brexit Party does best in Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire is where UKIP did best. Lincolnshire is where the Leave vote was strongest in the referendum. The Liberal Democrats do best in Richmond and Kingston in southwest London, exactly where the Liberal Democrats have always done best. The Green Party did best in Brighton and Bristol and Norwich, all the places the Green Party normally does best. And if you look at the UKIP vote, or the UKIP decline against the Brexit Party rise, so Nigel Farage 4 or 5 years ago to Nigel Farage now, they basically map onto one another almost perfectly. The Brexit Party did well where UKIP had done well 5 years ago. They did better than UKIP had done, for sure, but the places that they did well in were exactly the same places that UKIP had done well in. This is partly, I think, because there was some sort of electoral muscle memory there. These were people who'd voted UKIP before, and when Nigel Farage comes round again at a European election, you vote UKIP again. But they're also because the social demographics of this vote in the European elections last week were identical to the social demographics that have been driving British politics since 2016, and probably earlier. Look where the Brexit Party did best. They did best in constituencies with a large number of elderly or older voters, and with voters where there was a relatively low number of people with high levels of formal education. Those are exactly the places UKIP did well. Those are exactly the places that voted Leave. The Liberal Democrats, by contrast, did really well in places with high levels of formal education and where there were lots of young people. Again, exactly where the Remain vote traditionally had always been high. What you saw last week, essentially, was British politics as it has been played since 2014, just its latest manifestation. It reminded me a little bit, there's that line in Casablanca where the police chief, where Rick is asked what the police chief is like, and he says he's like most men, only more so. And this was like most recent British elections, only more so. It was just what we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years, but magnified. It was, to quote Theresa May, a case of nothing has changed. This was just what we've been seeing for the last 5 years. The second, and I think in some ways the most depressing thing about arguing nothing has changed, is the way the result has been interpreted. Now, on the slide I've put up what I think is a particularly bad example. It comes from the BBC, which is a shame, but there you go. Even the BBC aren't perfect. Of the sort of stuff that is pinging around British political social media at the moment, in which people take the results and try to show how the results indicate the outcome that they wanted from the election. So this apparently shows that anti-Brexit parties polled better than pro-Brexit parties. But it only does that by removing the Conservatives, who are quite clearly a pro-Brexit party, and Labour, who at least formally, on paper, are a pro-Brexit party. You can do this in all sorts of ways. You can add A to B and then add C, and then someone comes along and says, well, if you add D to B, then that's better than they do. And this is what's been going on since Sunday. I suspect it will go on for a couple more weeks as people try to interpret the results. The truth is, what they've shown is that of the people who voted, about a third of the British electorate now want to leave with no deal, of those who voted. There's about 40% who are desperate not to leave at all. And then there's a good chunk, about 25% in the middle, who would leave maybe if they could, or maybe stay if they could, but would want a deal. And we haven't really moved on very much from the 50 to 48% of the referendum. In fact, if you take the biggest poll of voters from the European elections, which was done by Michael Ashcroft, in which he explicitly asked the question, what is your preferred outcome? And you sum together the people who want to leave, and you sum together the people who want to remain, and you take out the don't knows, you get 52% want to leave and 48% want to remain, which is exactly where we were in 2014. And to really make you depressed, what I think is, maybe not surprised me, but struck me most about the results, is the extent to which people are interpreting them entirely through their prior beliefs. I have yet to hear a single politician react to the 2019 European elections by saying, well, I used to think this. Having seen what the electorate have said, I now think we must do this different course of action. Not one. All that has happened is they've dug in further. They've doubled down further. Which leads me on nicely to the Conservative leadership election, where there's going to be a lot of doubling down. Here are the 9 people who were standing when I finished the presentation. Since then, there's another 2. I can think of at least another 5 who are heavily rumoured, thought to be standing. So we could be up to, we've already hit 1 football team, and I think we've got more to come. The favourite is the man in the middle. Boris Johnson, the former Foreign Secretary. And whenever I talk about this to people outside of sort of Westminster, they say, who's the favourite? I say Boris Johnson. And they say, really? And the answer is yes, really. He is quite clearly the favourite in this election. He's the bookies' favourite. Polls show that he is the favourite at the moment of the Conservative grassroots. And you wouldn't bet against him. But I'm going to give you one insight into at least the lessons from history, which is that in every single Conservative election contest since 1965, the favourite has lost. It's true of Heath. Heath wasn't the favourite. Thatcher wasn't the favourite. John Major wasn't the favourite. Ian Duncan Smith. William Hague wasn't the favourite. Ian Duncan Smith wasn't the favourite. And on we go, even up to Theresa May. In fact, the favourite when Theresa May was elected was Boris Johnson, until Boris Johnson didn't run. Now, whenever I say this to people, I can see smiles go up on some people's faces. Okay, so he's going to get his comeuppance. But it is worth remembering that absolutely nothing about a trend ensures its continuation. My suspicion is the favourite will lose in every Conservative election until the day the favourite doesn't lose, and then everyone will say, well, that's the end of that rule. And maybe this is the election that proves that. So I'm not going to play Mystic Meg. I think with 11 runners already, it's far too difficult to predict what's going to happen. But let me talk you through what we think we know is going to happen in terms of the process. So the process in the Conservative election, and therefore the choice of the new Prime Minister, is that the Parliamentary Party, the British MPs in the Conservative Party, will narrow down the candidates to 2. It says probably up there because there's nothing actually in the rules that says it's 2, but it's always been 2 in the past, and we think it will be 2 this time. And they do that in a series of exhaustive ballots, one after the other, with the bottom person dropping out each time until you're left just with 2. You then send those 2 to the grassroots of the party, and you say, which of these 2 do you want? The grassroots then vote. And again, it says probably, because in 2003 that didn't happen, and in 2016 it didn't happen. But we think this time it will, not least because I think there is a desire amongst a lot of Conservatives, particularly after what happened with Theresa May. They want this candidate to be properly road tested. They don't want some coronation. They want a campaign in which they actually test this person, whoever this person is. And we assume, again, probably, that the person's position on Brexit will dominate when it comes to the voting of Conservative grassroots members. Now, what we know about Conservative grassroots members is that 2/3 of them back a no-deal Brexit, and almost all, bar about 16%, are opposed to the idea of a second referendum on Brexit. Now, in there, therefore, there are lots of ways in which a front-runner like Boris Johnson could trip up. It might, for example, be that he doesn't get to the final 2. It might anyway then be that if there is a long race, he underperforms in that long race, and it wouldn't be the first time that's happened to a candidate. But I think the main point about this contest, I suspect, is that it is going to constrain the choices of whoever comes in to be Prime Minister. Because in order to be both chosen and then stand a decent chance of winning, you are going to have to make sure you're not outflanked on Brexit. And so things like contemplating a second referendum, or saying that you wouldn't go for a no-deal Brexit, I think make you incredibly vulnerable in this contest. And therefore, in a sense, whoever it is, I suspect they are going to be dragged across politically to that sort of position if they are going to have a chance of winning. So we now move on to the things I really don't know about. So let's say we've got a new leadership in the Conservative Party and a new Prime Minister. Can that person then win a confidence vote in the House of Commons? That is not at all certain. The Conservatives, even with the support of the DUP, currently have a majority of about 5. It needs 3 people, just 3, to say we are withdrawing our support and voting to bring down the government. And there are easily enough Conservative MPs virulently opposed to the idea of a no-deal Brexit to support a no-deal government. So they might bring down the government. If they do that, there is 2 weeks in order to find an alternative who can then command the support of the House of Commons. It's not clear who that would be. And if you can't do that in 2 weeks, you have a general election. Now, who wins that general election? Well, the next slide is from the Ashcroft polling, which I talked about earlier, and which asked people in the big poll he ran on the European elections, who will you vote for at the next election? And it looks like this. If you take Ashcroft's figures seriously, and for reasons I'll explain in a minute, I think you should need to take them with a pinch of salt, you would have basically the British political system completely fragmenting. Brexit Party on 18, Liberal Democrats on 17, Labour on 21, Conservatives on 18, Green Party on 7. Votes going all over the place. At this point, the election basically becomes a crapshoot because you have no idea. It all depends where these voters are gathered and, spatially distributed. Almost anybody could emerge from that sort of election. Now, you should treat these figures with a pinch of salt because people are terrible at predicting their own behaviour. And if you've just polled someone in an election in which they voted for the Brexit Party and you said who are you going to vote for next time, they're more likely to say, I'm going to vote for the Brexit Party because they've just done it. And we know from the 2014 similar survey that people didn't behave as they said in 2014 they were going to behave. But still, the potential here, depending on how the parties respond to what's just happened, for the party system in Britain to fragment all over the place is massive. So let me go on to other questions where I bluntly don't know the answer, and I don't think anybody knows the answer. Will the UK leave the EU on the 31st of October as we're currently supposed to? I think it will be almost inevitable that the person that wins the Conservative leadership race will pledge for us to do so. That's not quite the same as saying it will happen by the 31st of October. Will there be another referendum? Again, I think whoever wins the Conservative leadership election may well have to rule out there being another referendum in order for them to become the winner of that contest. But that doesn't rule out there being one, but it's not at all clear what question would be asked in that referendum. We always used to think in terms of it being a choice between remaining or some deal. But if there isn't even a deal, does it become remain or no deal? Does it become remain, some deal, or no deal? What is this referendum? And whichever way you phrase this, someone is extremely unhappy. And then who wins that referendum? And bluntly, nobody knows the answer to that one either. Polls at the moment almost consistently show that if you asked people, do they want to remain or leave, Remain probably wins, but most polls in the immediate period before the referendum in 2016 showed that Remain would win as well, and it didn't. The gap is so small that a good campaign, one way or the other, could easily tip that result. I'll end with one final thought. As someone who has, in December, relocated with my other half to Hong Kong for a period, I'm always asked, as someone who is a specialist in British politics, is it a bad time to be away from British politics? And it is both simultaneously the best and the worst time to be away from Westminster. It's the worst time to be away from Westminster and British politics because there's a lot going on. It's interesting, it's exciting. It's the best time to be away from British politics because British politics at the moment, frankly, is horrible. It's nasty, spiteful, vicious, divisive, and miserable. And that is what happens if you promise people that you will implement something and 3 years later you have still not implemented something. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Philip, for that. I would be banging my head on the table if that didn't mean I'd be face down in my lunch. What a grim picture you are painting. Time for questions, and as usual, please state name and where you're from, affiliation. And we have a question straight away over there.
Nick Thompson, no affiliation. Do you think the situation would be quite a bit different if the European Union had given David Cameron something to walk away with?
Is it easy to do it from
I'll do it from maybe. And I think there's lots of really interesting counterfactuals about the 2016 referendum. I mean, should it have been called in the first place? Did they run the right campaign? But a really interesting one, which is rarely asked, is to go back and say, what if the reaction of the EU to David Cameron when David Cameron had gone in the run-up to that referendum had been different, and insofar as the EU had scope, been a little bit more generous. The Cameron strategy was always to say, we will have the referendum after we've gone back to the EU and renegotiated our relationship with the EU. And then the idea was that having renegotiated it, you then run a referendum based largely on, look, no one really wants to leave, and hey, it's got better because we've got this deal out of the EU. What was really striking about the 2016 campaign is the extent to which the supposed renegotiation barely featured. It was dismissed almost as soon as it happened, dead on arrival, made no impact on voters. If anything, it achieved the opposite, which was that it allowed people who wanted to leave the EU to say, this is the best you get, and it's feeble. They're not going to give you any more than this. The idea of staying in the EU and reforming the EU and making it better from within is for the birds. So I think it may be possible that it would have been better. I'm, in particular, very sceptical about people who claim that the referendum somehow had been decided 20 years ago, that it was all baked in longer-term frustrations with politics and so on. I mean, any decision which is taken on a 52-48 basis can be swung by some fairly insubstantial things one way or the other, and it could be that would have been one of them. And I think it'd be really interesting to go back and ask a few people, given the mess that Brexit has made, do you think in retrospect that the offer from the EU could have been more substantial? Because I think, and I know this from talking to people around Cameron, Cameron really struggled to persuade EU leaders in the run-up to that vote that there could be a leave vote. They all assumed Britain would vote to stay in. And he was desperate for polling evidence to try to show people, look, this is a real threat here. We could be leaving. Given the extent to which 3 years of chaos in Britain has impacted on the rest of the EU already, and bluntly will continue to do for the foreseeable future, I do wonder if several people think they may have been more generous back in sort of 2015. Yeah.
Question, lady over here.
Yeah. Thank you. Rachel Cartman, no affiliation. I'd like to ask another question about the EU too, about what's going to happen on 31st of October. If things in UK are like they are now, basically a snafu, what do you think the EU is more likely to do? Say, okay, poor old whoever happens to be the Prime Minister will give you more time, or say, bad luck, time's out you go on a no-deal basis?
Well, the official line is that there is going to be no more extension after the 31st of October. But the official line was there was going to be no extension in the first place. I mean, and the same people who said there was going to be no extension after the 31st are the same people who said there'd be no extension in the first place. So I think we treat some of this with a bit of scepticism. My suspicion is that a no-deal... I mean, a no-deal outcome, the conventional view is a no-deal outcome is worse for Britain, but it's not great for the EU either. And that the EU wants to avoid it, if at all possible. And so my working assumption is that they would offer an extension if an extension was requested. But there are at least two ways in which that might not happen. I mean, one is because a British Prime Minister has formally decided that he or she wants a no deal, and the majority of the people running to be Conservative Party leader at the moment have said that a no deal outcome would be satisfactory for them. With the caveat that some of them might be saying it but not mean it, but we do at least know, I think, there are enough people running for the Conservative leadership who both say it and believe it for it to be a realistic option. And the other way I think in which a no deal could easily come about is the system just implodes in Britain. I mean, I don't think this is a crazy prospect, that the system just stops functioning. There isn't a Prime Minister, for example, in those last few, or the Prime Minister doesn't have the confidence of the House of Commons, and we're in the middle of and doesn't have the power to do anything. And we sort of fall out by accident, because the default is that we leave with no deal on the 31st of October. Britain has to actively do something to stop that. And whilst I can see the EU giving an extension if it's requested, I wonder if they would just give one to a country whose political system had kind of just imploded. So, I do think a no deal outcome in October is a very realistic outcome at the moment for a variety of reasons.
I'm just getting more cheerful by the answer here. But, next question. Simon.
Thank you. Simon Pritchard, GavCal Research. Just thinking about your last point about chaos. In the event that a new Conservative party leader, Prime Minister, does not win a confidence vote, and that leads to a general election, your sort of chart of fragmentation and the indicative voting outcomes would point to sort of chaos and difficulty forming a government. The counterpoint could be, with people understanding that that's a realistic possibility, you do genuinely get a political party realignment prior to election. Do you see that at all being possible in the data, and is that practically enough time for something like that to happen before an election?
The potential for a realignment is definitely there. I mean, in essence, one of the things that has happened over the last couple of years, insofar as there has been a change, it is that the political system's become even more polarised. So if you look at the results from a few weeks ago, going back to the graph last week, I mean, the Brexit Party offers a really straightforward message, right? It kind of does what it says on the tin, right? Although, interestingly, there were 1% of people who voted for the Brexit Party who wanted to remain, and I'd love to know like, who those people were. The Liberal Democrats actually ran on a campaign entitled Bollocks to Brexit. I mean, that was the actual slogan, right? So there's a pretty straightforward, punchy, simple message there. Green Party, straightforward, want to revoke Article 50 and remain in the EU. SNP the same, applied a little bit more complicated, but still. The Conservative and Labour parties both stood on messages that were a bit more nuanced, right? In a bit more compromise. I mean, both of them formally say we should be leaving because we should respect the referendum result, but we should do so with a deal. You know, they differ on the type of deal and differ on the extent to which they might actually mean it and so on. But, you know, these were sort of attempts at compromise, and they got hammered. The parties that did well were the parties with really strong, straightforward messages. And we know from polling evidence that the percentage of people who align themselves with a political party is falling, and has been falling for years, but has carried on falling. The percentage of people who now see themselves as Remainers or Brexiteers is now much higher. Those are really strong identities. They're identities that weren't there, in that sense at least, prior to the referendum, but they now exist. And the potential for the party system somehow to sort of coalesce around those, I think, is genuine. There is no way that will happen by an election in sort of October, later on this year. Not least because the one attempt to do it recently by the group of people who broke away from both the Labour and Conservative Party set up a new party called Change UK. We're going to change. They're not even on this chart because I couldn't be bothered to go down into I mean, not a single MEP, dismal performance, hopeless. I mean, they would admit this, I mean, from the whole series of reasons why they did badly, but they did so terribly. Yes, the parties, the old parties, are in the sort of crossfire between these very strong Leave and Remain alignments that the voters have. And in time, yes, you can see them realigning, but there is not a hope in hell of that happening by any election this year.
Other question? Yes, there's one over here.
Aaron Gouch, FCC. Former American colonies, Trump 2020. Just a basic question, how important is a deal? I mean, Hong Kong had a deal, or they thought they did. Here we are, right? How important is it to have a deal? Or can we crash out and not to worry about it too much? Basic question.
I'm going to resist being tempted into the sino element of that question for all sorts of reasons, and just concentrate on the Brexit bit of it. You know, look, the 30-something%. I'll go through again. Hang on. There we go. The 35% of people who voted in that European, I don't think the deal's needed at all. The preferred option of a large chunk of Conservative voters, although that's not a very big group in this election, is for no deal. The best way, I think, to look at no deal politically is simply to say that that is not the view of, in quotes, the political elite, either in the Conservative Party as currently formed at the top. It was not Theresa May's view. She said it. She said no deal is better than a bad deal, but we know that almost from the moment she started to say it, she didn't really mean it. I mean, her view, right from the beginning of this process, was that we should leave with a deal because economically, in her view, no deal was catastrophic for Britain. That's not the view of the Labour Party. It's not the view of the Liberal Democrats. Not so. I'm not an economist, and I'm not going to get into whether they're right or they're wrong. It may be that the pro-no deal people are right, and that we can leave the EU without a deal, and it'll be damaging for a few years. Although sometimes when you ask them how many years, they say, well, about 30. And at that point, it kind of seems like quite a long period to be making ourselves worse off. But never mind. But they might be right. But politically, we know that is not where the balance of opinion at the top of the government has previously been or is in the opposition. It certainly isn't in Parliament. Maybe the key thing is it isn't in Parliament as currently constituted. There is no majority in Parliament at the moment for leaving with no deal. The question is the extent, as we run towards the 31st of October, to which Parliament can stop no deal anymore, short of bringing down the government. And that question is moot.
Another question? Sorry, there's one on the veranda there.
Hi, thanks. David Costello, Consul General of Ireland. There's a couple of things that obviously hasn't been touched on because it wasn't in the framework of your presentation. The first one is that Europe is going to be consumed with Europe in the run-up to the 31st of October because the new leadership of the European Union has to be decided, whether it's Weber, whether it's Michel Barnier. So when we're talking about leaving with a deal, we should be talking about leaving with the deal because there's not going to be a second deal. And I think that will come true in the Conservatives. It's disappointing to hear some of them saying, I can do a better negotiation, because the reality is the negotiation's over. But I think that chart is really, really interesting because the leadership election for the Conservatives is essentially putting the Conservatives into the into the pro-Brexit camp. So whatever happens, that 9% adds into the 34%. And I suppose the real question is, what's going to happen to Labour? They've been pretty much, the floor was wiped with them. Corbyn's leadership had not been under threat in any way up to now. And the message from this election seems to be around, you need to get off the fence and get into one camp or the other. And so I'm just interested to hear if you have any sense from your contacts on the ground. Is there going to be leadership heave in Labour as well? Is there an effort to bring better clarity to what their policy will be? And, as we're moving out of nuances on where you stand on this, where will Labour end up towards the end of September?
On the point about just the European issue and the leadership in Europe, which is a really good point. Somewhat contradictorily, the pro-Brexiteers in the Conservative Party argue that the change in leadership in Europe is going to be great because this opens up the prospect for reopening the deal because you have a new leadership that you can deal with. These very same people insist that we must leave by the 31st of October, and those two things cannot simultaneously be true. And what I'm not sure about is which one of them will break first, if you see what I mean. My suspicion is a deal, insofar as it is offered, will basically be the deal with yet further tweaks to the political declaration that accompanies the deal, and a Conservative leader may well come back and try to claim that in so doing they've made some great achievement, and I doubt that will be sufficient, but we shall see. The Labour Party one is tricky. I don't see any prospect of a challenge to Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party at the moment. Not because lots of people are happy with Jeremy Corbyn within the Labour Party, or at least within the parliamentary party and elements of the grassroots, but because those people who are sceptical about Corbyn have worked out by now that the very thing that will make him stronger is challenging him. It's like that bit in Star Wars where Obi-Wan says, you will strike me down and I will become more powerful than you can ever. It's a bit like that, except they never actually strike him down, he just becomes more powerful. Corbyn loves being run, he loves being challenged. It allows him to be the man standing up for the grassroots against the sort of elites of the party who can't cope with him. I mean, he loves it. And he did brilliantly the last time he was challenged. It just entrenched his position. So I don't think there'll be any formal challenge. What they're trying to do within Labour is to push the position, particularly on a second referendum. I mean, Labour are committed at the moment to having a second referendum if they can't get a general election. And they are committed to having Remain as an option on that referendum. What they're not yet committed to, and it's a really important caveat, is having a referendum on any deal. So the Labour/Corbyn position is, if we get a general election and we become the government, we will then do a deal, which would involve an extension beyond the 31st of October, but that would be no problem for the Labour Party, it's just a Tory problem. The deal obviously would look very similar. I mean, you and I know the deal would look very similar to the current deal, but it would be presented as a very different deal. Having achieved this amazing deal, we then don't need to have a referendum on it because it's a Labour deal and it's brilliant, unlike the Conservative deal, which is terrible. Now, a phrase like that, it sounds like I'm being terribly cynical, and maybe I am, because I am. But I have some sympathy for this position because it would be very difficult for the Labour Party, it seems to me, to go away, negotiate a deal, and then put it to the people in a referendum in which they have to urge people to not vote for the deal that they've just... I just don't understand how that works. I mean, what does Labour... How does Labour come back and say, this is the best deal we've got, but anyway, we think we should stay, because that's better than the deal we've got, in which case you clearly negotiate a terrible deal. And that doesn't sound like respecting the result of the previous referendum in 2016, which Labour have always said they do. So I have some sympathy for the Corbyn position on this. I also have some sympathy for the Corbyn political position on this. For those of you, some of you will know some of this political geography, but for those that don't, and here I use football clubs as my explanation. If you look at where football clubs, so the four divisions in British football, or English and Welsh football, are located, the constituency that has the most pro-Remain vote, that has a football stadium in it, is Bristol West. That's a Labour seat. The constituency with a football club in it that has the most Leave vote is Stoke-on-Trent South. That's a Labour seat. So Labour has this problem that it has these seats with, which almost overwhelmingly voted Leave, and it has these seats that overwhelmingly voted Remain. And the battle within Labour since 2016 has been between people who sit for Remain seats and people who sit for Leave seats. Now, the reality is a little bit more complicated than that, because you can be in a Leave seat, but most of your voters might have voted Remain, but you need some of the Leave voters to support you, and so on. But there is a real political tension there for Labour. They're not just being stubborn, the Corbyn leadership, although they are stubborn. The reason they are resistant to hold this referendum is because to commit to the referendum under any circumstances, is because they think they will get hammered on it in their northern seats, Midlands and northern seats. The problem, as you saw from this, is they're currently getting hammered everywhere at the moment, and so the pressure is on them to try to come off one way or the other. Based on what we saw over the last couple of days, my instinct is on them simply nuancing the position yet further. So we were told over the weekend that John McDonnell had moved position, and when you actually looked at the words, it looked very similar, but it got him a front page splash in The Guardian. It was so credulous, I couldn't quite believe that they went for it, but they did. Labour has shifted, and then you look at the detail, and Labour hasn't really shifted. And I think they will try and do that for as long as they can, because they really do not want to come off one way or the other. What they want, Labour have always wanted, is for the Tories to sort this out, one way or the other. And then Labour can say, isn't it terrible? It's terrible. We told you it'd be terrible. Bloody Tories. And then they can go in and be the government. They don't want their hands anywhere near it. The trouble for Labour is that the Tories are nowhere near sorting it out. at the moment.
Okay, time for one more question to see if we can get even more depressed before we finish. Any takers? Anyone on the veranda? I can't see. Okay, in which case sorry, gentleman in the front here.
So just a quick question about the oddity of the Brexit party. Given that there is no party, it's just Nigel Farage, no membership, nothing beyond no deal Brexit as the platform. Is this a pointer to the future of British politics, or is it a one-off?
Yes, it's true. It's a company. Farage, so scarred by his experience in UKIP for decades, that he set up a party in which he basically controls it. I suspect it's not a foretaste of what is to come, but who knows. But still, what was really interesting, as you say, was that they were able to run with effectively no manifesto on any other policy, except on Brexit. And, in practical terms, how many people even read the policy on Brexit? Right? This was, anyone here from, it's a straightforward populist party. They are letting you down, they are betraying you, we need to send them a message. It's familiar stuff. What I think, however, is interesting about it is just how polished and competent it was compared to some of the Remain equivalents, which were nowhere near as polished and nowhere near as competent. And it is one of the reasons that I would be, if I was a Remainer, whilst I would still be arguing for a referendum, because why the hell not? I mean, we've got a chance of winning it if you have it. I would not be at all hopeful that I would win it as a Remainer. I think these messages are so powerful and so evocative, to come back to, we were told, this is your decision, and we will implement your decision. And they have let you down. And once you've got into that narrative, everything that fails following on from that, every bit of economic collapse, every bit of economic difficulty, every bit of chaos, it's not the fault of the people that are arguing, it's the fault of the people that have let you down.
Okay, we've been through football clubs, Obi-Wan Kenobi, My Little Pony. No conclusions perhaps, but lots to think about. So we've got to wrap this up now. So it just remains for me to say thank you, Philip, and we may well have you back, but we've got more to talk about on this. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.